And we are ready to go in our third module. Oops. Teams is just doing this thing where it's just spinning right now for me, so we're going to give it a second to think about its choices. Okay. I am now going to load our third module. Feel free to, this time, because we're all about adapting, right? We're going to type our questions into the chat. And so feel free at any point during this, if you hear something that sparks a question or a brainworm, well, I hope it doesn't spark a brainworm. That's something totally different that we can't control here. But type it into the chat box and that will be great. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, Paul. Thanks for coming on camera to tell me that the audio is working. It's like we practiced this or something. All right, here we go.
Strong, resilient prairie is important, not only for the little Dakota skippers out here, but also for the plants in general, because we don't want those invasive species that are coming. We see them on many of our other sites. This prairie is going to be here for generations to come, and we want it to remain that way. All the way from the skipper to the big bison that used to be across here. Someday, maybe again, but we'll get cattle instead. For now.
The beauty of this site is we have a number of, we'll just say, research projects out here, some good biological documentation, which really excites me because we'll be able to use those things to help fine-tune our management as we move forward. You know, we get a year like this year, you throw a drought in the picture, you get late freezes in the spring, it kind of complicates things a little. It's not normal or average. And so we need to collect enough data over a number of years.
We're monitoring a setup of square meter plots throughout the whole preserve with the goal of trying to capture what changes in vegetation are occurring related to our grazing that's happening out here. So one of the main things that we're after, one of the main management goals of grazing out here is to try to reduce the cover and abundance of smooth brome. So one of the things that we've added to kind of our normal procedures for recording vegetation in these plots is actually just counting the stems of smooth brome that occur in the 1/10 of a meter square quadrats, a little box here. The rest of the setup here is mostly just for recording all of the plant species that occur within this square meter plot. And we have a few hundred of these spread out throughout the whole preserve. So getting quite a bit of data, hoping to track the changes in the vegetation. I think the things that I'm interested in this project, and I think that a lot of people that I talk to about it ask questions about, are just the idea of getting all of these different values out of the prairie. We get our diversity. We have butterflies out here galore. The native plants out here are fantastic to come and explore. We also have hunting and things like that out here. A lot of people come out hunting, and then we also get cattle production, and that benefits those other goals. And I think that's a really exciting place to start exploring.
We want to make it stronger. We want to make it more robust, and we can use the tools of fire. We can use the tools of ruminant animal impact. We can use the tool of rest also. And we want to mix those things up, and by doing so, we're going to build resiliency in the system. We see plant diversity increase, and subsequently we see wildlife diversity increase.
We've learned so far, we're hoping the plot data can tell us whether or not our management is being effective, whether our grazing is actually reducing the brome that we're kind of targeting, whether we're having side effects on native species, if something is sensitive to our grazing regime or reducing some of the native species, we really want to think about what we're doing. Hopefully we're going to get an increase in native diversity as we start reducing our brome cover. We've been doing the plots for a number of years and we have been seeing brome increase, but we're just starting to ramp up the grazing out here. So we've got a good set of data before we've started grazing some of these areas, and now we just need to wait a few years to see if we can see what the effects of grazing are.
I'm one of 2 regional non-game wildlife specialists for the DNR, and the Prairie Coteau is a conservation focus area for the DNR, and Hole in the Mountain is a key part of that. One of our priorities in the conservation focus area is to conduct effectiveness monitoring to help determine how good our restorations are. Are they functional? It's more that, prairie is more than just the plants. It's the wildlife as well that live there. It's the whole system. And so this is part of our piece of that puzzle, is to help, assess. So one of the things we were doing is monitoring prairie butterflies and bumblebees in the restorations, yes. And not too far from here, it's possible that at least at one of our sites that maybe one of the Dakota skippers might show up.
It's awesome. There's not a whole lot of places in Minnesota where you can get into them and feel like the prairie is the only thing around you. This is one of them. I think the first time I went out here, there were just swarms and swarms of regal fritillaries, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the whole world to just have massive flight of butterflies while I was working out on the prairie.
There's got to be a part of you that's just really jazzed to be here today.
Oh, well, yeah, that is the other aspect. There's the part that is the responsible biologist that, I'm making a difference. But then there's the part that's just 12. And it is just so neat to be out on the prairie, and when it's not 97 degrees. And to see Dakota skippers, are you kidding me? A federally listed species? I am jazzed. And, it's an opportunity for me to learn and to be with a lot of really neat people who also love prairie. Because it's part of our culture. It's part of our natural world. I know that, others have talked about, Aldo Leopold's saying that the first rule of intelligent tinkering is to save all parts. Well, another aspect is that, as I always feel that humans are a part of, not apart from our environment. And so when we're losing species, that's a clear sign that the systems that hold everything together, not just prairie, but us, that support us, that they're unraveling. And so this is part of health. This is part about taking care of not only prairie, but ourselves.
All right. Another great job to everybody who just presented in that video. I'm going to ask for Dustin to come on camera. And we had a bunch of monitoring questions earlier, so I'm going to try to grab them so that we can just start with them. And Lisa, if you also if people have specific questions about the effectiveness monitoring, if you feel comfortable answering those, I would love for you to do so.
Hey Megan, can we just show the maps of the exclosures again? I just wanted to quickly explain where the different monitoring setups were, because they don't entirely correspond with the management units. And so we've got on this map, the yellow dots are circular exclosures that were set up in 2017. Our baseline data for these got collected in 2016. And the exclosures are a fenced off set of plots paired with a set of plots that are open to grazing. So both get fire. only one of them gets grazing when the unit is burned. So that is one of our more rigorous ways that we're hoping to document what the patch burn grazing is doing. And then on top of that, we have a grid of the 1 square meter quadrats, which you saw me sampling in the video, throughout the entire thing. So that's over the patch burn grazing unit as well as the adaptive management units. And we started collecting that data in 2017 and have collected it in 19, 20, and 21. The exclosures are getting resampled next year, so that'll be our second data point for the management on those. So I hope that clears up what is actually going on out there. In addition to that, there is the restoration monitoring going out there, and Dakota skipper monitoring, which is going to get talked about in the next section. So lots of great data getting collected.
Absolutely. So our key biological monitoring, just in summary, is on vegetation, pollinators, and Dakota skippers. And then we have that spread out across the native parts of the site as well as the reconstruction. So that's our quick summary there. Becky, if you want to go ahead and put Becky Esser, if you want to go ahead and put the evaluation link in the chat, just to remind people again of where that is so that they have it. And then we will just start with Molly's question if you want to go ahead and give voice to it. And then I will go find all the questions on the Padlet.
I just took a big bite of Doritos. I wondered what the utilization rate was and then how you measured that and were you finding that you were meeting that goal?
The utilization rate in terms of
how much forage you wanted to use versus how much was left, and maybe it's a question for Ken.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better Kent question than me. If Kent wants to pop back on.
Yeah, the utilization rate changed a bit from site to site, but really we were shooting for no more than 50% in order to protect the roots and crowns of the plants that are out there. We tried to get as much stock density just for disturbance in there this year. So we focused more on stock density this year and keeping the utilization rate at or below 50%. So the producer was monitoring that, and I don't have that data from him right now. We'd have to talk to him, but it was a bit challenging with the drought out there, and there's a learning curve here too. He was learning how a bit more to apply adaptive grazing, and so we'll be talking about those things and making adjustments for next year.
In terms of the patch burn grazing study, we've been trying to monitor where the cows are actually doing their grazing by using the VOR, as well as collecting notes while we're out there on grazing utilization in and around the plot. And that's kind of shown us that they've been using that last year's burn paddock to some extent as well, and kind of trying to figure out where and why they're doing that. So they kind of make grazing lawns in that other paddock every year.
Sorry, I was trying to scroll way back into the chat to find the very first monitoring question that I skipped over, which this is a long chat, which means that you guys are doing great work here, talking to each other, which is what we want you to do. So why, if you want to speak a little bit to the re-canary grass question that's here in the upper left, Dustin, and yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, there's a lot of the draws in the site are either pretty heavy re-canary grass or pretty heavy brome. And they do get eaten in the burn year to some extent. This year, the cattle hit the draws really hard. So I'm very excited to see if we're going to see some more expression of native sedges and some Spartina come back. I'm also pretty excited because in the adaptive management units on the east side, the ones that were grazed earlier this year, so from May to June, the cattle were grazing pretty evenly across it, even in those reed canary draws. And so they kept that reed canary chopped down pretty heavily. And we did see some more expression of natives than was there in the past. So I would be excited to see if we keep that up long term, if we start to get more abundance of those things. They definitely were much bigger than they had been in the past, or much more expressed.
And then I found the question from earlier from Callie. So it's the money question. So are the cool season grasses being reduced? What do we know so far?
Yeah. So I like to compare the site to some of the controls I have elsewhere in the state. So a very similar setup on 2 SNAs and 2 prairie banks throughout the rest of this site. And the parts of those that have not been managed have been increasing in brome abundance fairly regularly each year. And on this site, so far we've noticed that in the pasture grazing project, brome has either stayed about the same or increased slightly. So compared to our control data, we're being successful. Compared to our management goal of decreasing brome, probably kind of troubling at this point. But we've only collected 1 year of the exclosure data after grazing has been out there, and about 3 years of the distributed quadrats throughout the site. And there are some interesting things. So this is the first couple of years that we've done the brome stem counts, which I'm basing most of this off of. And something I'm trying to wrap my head around is that I'm getting responses that I didn't expect. So kind of like when you cut a tree down and a whole bunch of new shoots pop up and now you have 5 tree stems instead of 1. Brome, when it's munched down or cut off, we'll do the similar thing where it'll sprout a whole bunch of sprouts. And so I think we're kind of getting an artifact of that in some of our data, where the first year after an impact or the year of that brome getting impacted, it tends to have this multi-stemmed expression. And so I think there might be some amount of we're having impact on the brome, but our data is kind of showing the opposite. But we need to wait and see if that's true. I don't know at this point. Need to figure it out.
Dustin, do you want to talk a little bit about how the monitoring that you're doing allows you to kind of pinpoint where different species are across the site? And then we'll jump to a couple of the utilization questions and other things.
Yeah, so Megan has the quadrat set up. So the distributed quadrat, the ones without exclusions on the screen right now. And we'll walk to each of them and identify all the plants in them, as well as count the brome. So we get a really good idea of where our high diversity sites are, where the places that have heavy brome infestations and are starting to tip away from that native prairie into a cool season pasture sort of plant community each year. And we talked over this stuff with Kent a little bit to try to tune our grazing to these places that need disturbance or need work to try to reduce that smooth brome. Another note about this site, I think we're super lucky because the site isn't too far gone. It has brome, it has some areas with some really dense brome, but even in those, there's a lot of native diversity underneath of it that's just waiting to be expressed if we could manage it correctly.
Perfect. Morgan had a question about how are we measuring utilization? I was going to say, how are we utilizing utilization? And Kent, you touched on that a little bit earlier. If you want to elaborate a little bit or summarize the 50%.
Yeah, I think Nick's using just a visual assessment. I'm not sure if he's using a grazing stick. He is using the Maya Grazing app, to document stuff. And I have not had an opportunity to dig into all the data he collected and look at all that data yet, but we hope to be doing that this winter. So.
Perfect. Jessica, do you want to give voice to your question about drought conditions and utilization planning? This might also be another Kent question.
Yeah, after I typed it, I realized it was probably more Kent, but
it's okay. They're all here.
It's more over because I heard you vary everything, but it seems like the leave half, take half, or less. And here we were this year in the drought in Montana, and we were using that to really do some cleanup. So we were taking advantage of the drought and people needing grass for their cows and actually hitting stuff harder. And I was just wondering if you guys were doing that at all.
That sort of happened by default on the patch burn graze. It got hit pretty hard. And so I think we're going to get a good assessment on that, as Dustin's saying, as we gather more data in the future.
Yeah, I'm actually super excited about the drought grazing interaction, because there's quite a bit of literature that is based on spring fire, that pretty much says if you have a wet year after you've done a spring burn, like, don't expect to have much impact on cool season grasses. It pretty much kind of negates your management or makes it less effective. But in the normal years or drought years, I think that kind of indicates that maybe we'd have a bigger response from these bigger impact on these cool season grasses. So I'm excited to see if that happens. I'm very hopeful, but it's kind of hard to be hopeful with smooth brome.
Amber, do you want to speak a little bit to the panic moment that we kind of all had, and then what you saw in your recent site visit out there?
Sure. When we went out to go do these videos, we kind of stopped and took a little investigation of it, and the cattle were just sitting on the patch burn, and the site was like a golf course, and that's no way what I ever wanted to accomplish out there, because I always wanted to leave some sort of habitat, some sort of grass cover for not only the soil to stay healthy to keep the microbes living, but just for anything that utilizes the grass and the forbs above the soil. So it was a slight panic moment, like, oh my gosh, what have we done? But I was out there back in November. This is a picture from one of the sites. It wasn't on the patch, it was just off. But the vegetation did come back. I'm not sure if Megan can find a picture quickly of the patch, but this was inside one of the exclosures. Quick flash to that one. A lot of the like little blue stem side oats, goldenrod, were coming back up on there. This, I think, is on the northern end of the patch looking south. I don't know if we got a good one of it.
I know I'm going too fast. I'm trying to find it. I'm just clicking on all the pictures to see if it's one of these.
The main point was we didn't leave it completely naked out there. The grasses did come back. So this one you can kind of see it. You can see the tufts of the tufted grass coming back out there. It's not a naked landscape like we were afraid it was going to be. So it's kind of exciting to see that the vegetation did respond once we got a little bit of precip there. The cows were pulled off the patch at the beginning of August. So they had about a month rest before when they were normally going to be pulled off. So.
And this is the exclosure with that the cows don't have access to, and you can kind of see in this picture framing a little bit of the height inside the exclosure, and then also outside that we did get good recovery. And then Amber also noted that we got really good heterogeneity. That's my fancy word for the day. We got a lot of different types of structure out there, which our hope is that will benefit different groups of wildlife. And so that is heterogeneity in structure is also a measure that we haven't talked about yet today, but that's something that we are looking for. Paul, do you want to give voice to your question?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious. You're monitoring a bunch of different stuff, and I'm just curious how you balance out the results from all those different things, and if there's one thing that really kind of tends to be the overall one that trumps other things, like thinking about like Dakota skippers and endangered species. That's pretty important. Yeah, just wondering how you balance those, and if there is that one that kind of takes the lead.
From my perspective, the goals are reduce our cool season invasives and maintain native plant diversity. I think if we start seeing our invasives increase, we're going to have a hard conversation. And if we see our native diversity tank or the composition really change into more of a pasture composition, we'll probably have a conversation. Amber may have some other things on her mind than that. I'm very vegetation focused. So.
We're very game focused in wildlife, so pheasants, deer, and everything else that go with it. But not only just that, we want to see more, like somebody mentioned, the jackrabbits out there. We don't have much of a jackrabbit population anymore just because of how our landscape has changed over the years. And my first initial thought when I went onto the site in November was like, this would be perfect jackrabbit habitat. When I did my little bit of work out in South Dakota, this is what the sites look like. And we had jackrabbits everywhere at that time. So I'm kind of excited to see how this has changed and maybe bring in some of those other wildlife species that we haven't seen in the area in a very long time.
This may be a group question. Should you leave grasses at a certain height going into winter? How do you know when you've grazed too hard? And Amber, if you want to start, I guess, and then we'll go to Kent and Dustin for more comments. But if you want to start with how we felt like we had grazed the site too hard when we saw it this summer, what were some of the things we looked at that were panicky?
Again, my initial thought was I made a golf course, and I don't want to do that because that's not really going to sustain any sort of wildlife species, butterfly, anything like that. We want the ground with some sort of cover to at least protect even the subsoil little microbes down there, because the heat of the day can kill those off. Kent can speak to that. He's great, like talking about everything that's part of grazing. So I'll just leave it with that one. But we still need the variability out there. Some bare landscape is good because there's so many different animals out there that need the bareness all the way to like the thick matted vegetation cover. And that's what we're trying to accomplish out here, just a diversity across the landscape to benefit not just my game animals, but like Lisa's non-game animals, right down to the little butterflies. So it's a big group effort.
Yeah, it really is a big group effort. And, what are your goals for that site? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the targets you want to hit? And so that's huge. When Amber and I went out to that site and saw a lot of bare ground, I got a little nervous about carbon cycling. I got a little nervous about the potential for erosion. Not that we don't want some bare sites for these other critters out there, and they need those bare sites, but it was a large acreage that we were seeing it on, and I think that made us all a bit nervous. Now, we did get rains starting just shortly after we were out there, and that probably was a reason for a lot of the recovery out there, and that's great. I see somebody asked about how much should we be leaving out there, and again, what are your goals? What are you managing for? What are you trying to accomplish?
Dustin, do you have anything you want to add to that? I also popped up our goals so people could see what they are.
I think from my perspective, I'm not thinking about wildlife right now because I can do that as a plant ecologist, at least a little bit. What I always think about is that our cool seasons are coming back in the fall. And if we hit them again, we might be helping us get somewhere. And so the period from like October to November, it is another opportunity for us to potentially impact our brome, especially. And I would be okay with making trade-offs of hitting those areas and leaving less vegetation over winter there, given that there's other places on the site, or given that it's a small enough area that there is habitat to sustain, there are remnants for habitat left on the site for overwintering. I think it's really hard because we're learning more and more that to change plant composition of prairies, you really have to do a lot to them. And that's really hard to balance with habitat for other things. So that's why I need the other people working here so that I don't denude the entire thing every year.
Exactly. We're working holistically, ecologically. Does the person who asked this question want to, oh, sorry, Kent, do you have more you want to say?
Yeah, just real quick. You know, there were a whole list of things, as Amber said earlier, that we tried to implement and do this year, including, you know, sort of recalibrating the cooperator, if you will, as well as ourselves on this site. And a lot of these questions that you're asking are great because we want to continue to adapt. We want to continue to fine tune. Where this is not a one and done, and it's going to require discussions of this level and these kind of questions for us to think about how we're going to make changes for next year. And it's coming down to a lot of this is questions about how much do we want of what, you know, on the site. And I think, you know, Megan, Amber, Dustin are going to, and even Lisa are going to have to contribute to a lot of that conversation. And we can adapt the grazing to fit that. We're talking about now fine tuning something we applied on a very gross scale just to get through it once and start doing some things. Now that we've done that, now we start getting more myopic in our focus, and that's all part of being adaptive.
Absolutely. And I hope what you're hearing too, I don't want to leave out the zoo or Jess Peterson, all of our fantastic Dakota skipper biologists. I hope what you guys are hearing us say is we meet a lot. we like each other and we have lots of meetings because we are trying to figure out what to do and how all the pieces fold together, because the ultimate goal is making sure that this is well thought out, holistic, as ecological as we can make it, and that means that you need a lot of expertise coming together to think through those things. Let's go through these two questions here. First, did you distribute the exposures randomly or intentionally? And then we'll move down to this question about conservative plant species. Dustin, if you want to take the lead.
Yeah, so the exposure setup was done by doing some GIS work to try to identify a number of sites where it looked like there was a decently large patch of vegetation that was similar, and then identifying 2 locations for plots in that area, and then flipping a coin and randomly assigning one of those 2 areas or two plots within the areas for an exclosure. So trying to bias it as little as we could in terms of what was there before we sampled stuff, or before grazing occurred. The grid was just a grid that was placed over the entire thing. So, and those are 70 meters apart for the grid.
Perfect. You want to talk about this one? Are you doing any monitoring of specific conservative plant species of concern? That could be ice cream plants, delicious for adult cows, or for food/nectar sources for skipper, larvae, or adults. And Amber, if you want to weigh in here too, or Kent, that's welcome. We do know, thankfully, that Echinacea, the plant that skippers perch on, gals don't like it. So it's actually been great in that sense because it's a scratchy plant and it doesn't feel very nice if you try to eat it.
Yeah, so we're not doing any other specific thing for our more conservative species. We're hoping that as many plots as we have in that grid setup, that we're going to be able to capture enough data to detect changes in them. So after every survey year, I run some statistics to try to figure out if we notice changes in any of the plants, not only the conservative ones, but all of the other plants that are out there too. And so we haven't really been seeing changes in conservative plant species as of yet. We have been able to detect some increases in what we call the grazing increaser plants, things like verbena, Retibita have increased out there to some extent. We're seeing some changes in composition. They're fairly minor at this point. So it takes a lot to change a prairie.
Sarah, do you want to give voice to your question that's in the Padlet? That's what you get for typing your name.
I know, well, I did on purpose because yeah, no, Dustin talked about this just a tiny bit, but I think it deserves more discussion, and I think it's something that we're going to all have to, like, as a conservation community, be discussing a lot in the near future, and that's just how we can think about and process maybe the conflicts between the kinds of management that we are starting to think we need to reduce cool season invasive grasses versus some of the needs of other resources out there that we care a lot about. And I love all the stuff in the chat about, you know, the diversity of habitat and diversity of wildlife, but, you know, there's other things too, like really short-term impacts if you are dealing with something like Dakota skipper, and, you know, that's maybe more of a fire thing than a grazing thing, but we don't know for sure. So I just am curious how everybody's thinking about that, and yeah, just I think it's something we're going to have to be very conscious about and talking about a lot soon.
Absolutely. Dustin, you want to start, and then we'll go to Amber and Kent, and then I'll say a few things.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I'm usually more on the side of trying to do management that impacts stuff as heavy as we can to try to get somewhere. And I need my colleagues to tell me maybe we need to step back a bit and think about some of these other things that we need from this site. So and I'm there because I've been collecting the data, and things like the brome not decreasing on the site after we've been grazing it, after we've been burning it, are really troubling to me. And so I want to keep stepping up until we figure out where that line is of management, that level of intensity that we need to get places.
Amber, go ahead.
It's been kind of nerve-wracking managing this site just because it is our like most heavily managed site in our work area. Most of the other sites are maybe once every 4 or 5 years we might get a burn out there or even a haying, but this site we've been repeatedly doing something on, and to find out that we haven't really been making an impact on the brome like we were hoping we would see. But again, this brome has been set out here for years and years without anything else to impact it. So it might take years and years for us to see an impact on it. So we'll keep following what Dustin's finding and make our management based on his research. So.
And the collective too of what Lisa is looking at in the zoo, what we see there, we're all the players together. Ken, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, as Amber alluded to, we didn't get to where we're at on this site overnight. You know, there's over a century of probably a century and a half of quote unquote management or whatever. It's not going to change overnight, but we do see on sites that implement even adaptive grazing, or even if we think about natural ecological succession, the vegetative community does change over time, and it's going to take some time. We tend to like, you know, our instant coffee and our instant noodles and everything like that in our society. Our instant, you know, we want to see this movie, we want to see it now, we order it on Netflix. That's the society we live in, and nature runs on a long timeline, and we got to work within that timeline, and we got to work within that context. So we're going to change and adapt and learn and grow through this, and it's going to require critical evaluation to do that. But I think we can move forward. You know, I know this summer Amber mentioned standing on that east unit up there, just differences she was seeing after running the cattle out there in 1 year. And so maybe it's not as dramatic as we want to see, but I think it was a hint or an indication that we can move the needle. We just have to be diligent in moving forward and being adaptive and adjust as we go.
Well, and two things I will add to that. If you note, I keep showing this map just to help folks who aren't familiar with the site. I'm a visual person, so I think sometimes it helps. These are our patch burn graze units, again in orange, and then adaptive management grazing is in blue, including this east unit up here. And so we just started implementing adaptive management grazing this year. And part of why we implemented it is because we were adapting. So as we were getting some of the results from the patch burn graze study, which again, we don't have a lot of years of data there yet either, to be fair, we weren't liking what we were seeing. And so we were like, okay, what if we already start adapting and let's incorporate a different grazing model, and then we can kind of compare and contrast how we're doing and see, you know, if this has more or faster, or whatever the word is you want to use, a better impact on brome out there. And so I think that's something to keep in mind too, that we've already been thinking through, okay, this is what the data is telling us so far. Granted, grain of salt, we don't have a lot of years of data, but we already want to make some decisions. And that's what led us to this model. The other thing, to speak to Sarah's point about conflict, is that I don't want to, I feel like I should knock on wood before I answer this, because I don't want to put us and our partners in a bad position. But the beauty of this site and this project and the team that we have formed across all of these different organizations and within the DNR is that there hasn't really been a lot of fighting. There's been some disagreement, but we have been able to move forward and overcome that. And so to get to Paul's question and Sarah's question too, like what trumps what? Ultimately, what we are doing is saying that the prairie as a whole is what we are looking at. And so that's not a cheating answer, that's a real answer. And so as we look at what's happening with the plants, what's happening with the pollinators, what's happening with the skipper, we want to use all of those pieces kind of equally together to help us make some decisions. And so one of the things that we're already thinking through this year is that our release site for skippers was right here, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, guys. I think it was just in this southern part of Unit 1.
It was just in Northern 4.
Oh, Northern 4, right here, sorry. Rightish here-ish. And so one of the things that we're thinking about, because in our patch burn graze model, we rotate around counterclockwise through these units in burning, when it gets time to burn Unit 1, we might need to think about how we do that, or do we need to have like a fire break here or something so that we can really protect this release site as best as possible. And that's where we'll be working with the zoo and Jessica Peterson, our invertebrate ecologist, to sort of help us figure out, okay, yes, we're not going to abandon patch burn graze, but how do we put in some contingencies and some thoughtful planning so that we don't just wipe out skippers the year after we introduce them? Like, we don't want to do that, right? I'm laughing not because it's funny, I'm laughing because it's terrifying. So those are, I don't know if that helps, Sarah, but those are like all the things that we kind of think about and talk through and put on our adult pants with each other and have real conversations about what we think needs to happen next. Okay, I'm just scrolling here. We probably have time for one more question, and so we'll end with this question from Tom. How will you use the monitoring data to adapt grazing and fire management? Will the response be different for reconstructions versus remnant prairie, or do you think the response will be different?
Sorry, what was that?
How will you use the monitoring data to adapt grazing and fire management? Will the response be different, do you think, for reconstructions versus remnant prairie?
The difference that I think about the most is how we're going to try to incorporate the monitoring data more into the adaptive grazing that we're doing. So when we start to figure out what responses we're seeing and how to target stuff better, and working with Kent and the producer on trying to target our fencing and our paddocks to meet those goals, I'm really interested to see where that goes in the future. The monitoring data for patch burn grazing, I think it's part of a larger project with 2 other sites in Minnesota, one at Chippewa Prairie and one way up north in Caribou. And so I think those are a little bit more locked in as a larger attempts to put together a really good body of knowledge about pasturing grazing in Minnesota, where we have a little bit higher rainfall than a lot of where the literature was, where the research for the literature that currently exists was conducted. I don't do the monitoring on the restorations. I'll have to let Megan or Amber talk about that and how you guys plan to use that.
Yeah, so basically we are using the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative protocol, monitoring protocol. There's 2 different versions of that protocol. Well, I don't know if 2 different versions is right, but there's 2 different ways to do it. There's a meandering walk and then there's quantitative plot data. And so we are doing quantitative plot data out there, but Lisa and Mike, our non-game wildlife biologists, also are working with a contractor to collect meandering walk data in reconstructions. So we'll end up getting kind of both sets of data. So what we're using that for, again, we just started taking that this year, collecting that for on the quantitative plot side. We're mostly using it to reassure us that what we planted grew and see how the restoration evolves through time. So right now we're not planning on making any drastic decisions other than we're absolutely not going to spray that thistle. It's going to be there to support all the pollinators that were on it this summer. And so we kind of, I mean, I know that's a weird answer, but like we don't have plans to change anything yet because we don't have enough data yet to tell us anything. So this year, mostly what it did was just reassure us that what we planted grew. So we are at break time. We are headed into our last module. We're going to reconvene here at 11:04 because that's when we're going to be done talking. And so the plan is for this last module is we're going to go back to the chat and just use the chat